this fucking idiot doing?
Probably should have. This is a corner of the hip-hop universe that is to rap what nerd rock is to regular rock. In fact, we could do a whole show on just nerdcore, reaching back to the Beastie Boys and following through artists like MC 900 Foot Jesus, Kool Keith, MF Doom, and a whole bunch more. If that sounds appealing, dig around on the internet for Geeksta Rap. That's Geeksta Rap. Geeksta Rap. It exists. If I can be of further assistance on this topic or any other, my email is alan@alancross.ca. You can also look at my website, which is ajournalofmusicalthings.com. That website comes with a newsletter that sends fresh music news and information to your inbox by 10 a.m. Eastern every day. I can also be found through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Google+. And I hope you can give me a look or a follow if you get a chance. Finally, there's the matter of the podcast. Dozens and dozens and dozens of these shows have been turned into podcasts and are available for free download through iTunes or virtually anywhere else you get your on-demand audio. Get them all. I'll keep this available. Technical production is our resident nerd, Rob Johnston. And I'm nerdy Alan Cross. You've been listening to Beyond the Mystery of New Music podcast with Alan Cross. And subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and everywhere you find your favorite podcasts. Before we leave today's Ongoing History of New Music podcast, I want you to know that we're part of a network called CuriousCast. And CuriousCast has a lot of podcasts available on its network. And one of the new ones is called Art Context. And I have two of the hosts of Art Context with me here. We have Tash Krishna and Director X. And we want to give you a bit of an introduction as to what this new podcast is all about. So who wants to go first and explain exactly what you guys will be doing? And obviously, there's a hint here at the end of this podcast, my podcast. Jetstar has something to do with me.
So our show is pretty much about, it's in the world of music. It's pretty much us sitting down with storytellers that come from music videos. I feel like we live in a world where we don't give these amazing creative artists the flowers they deserve. They create some of the most impactful content on the planet that gets a lot of eyeballs on it. And coming from the world of music video, being in the business for over 20 years, we felt it was necessary to create a show like Architects. You would sit down and hear their stories, their comings, their journey, their process of creating some of the most iconic music videos, films, and content on the planet.
Well, you guys have been deeply involved in this world for, I would say, a long time. Who have you worked with?
I've directed videos for Alicia Keys, Daddy, Cisco, Destiny's Child, Drake, Justin Bieber, 2 Chainz, Rosalia, Iggy, Sean Paul, Benny Man, Ariana Grande.
Okay, now you're just bragging.
Lord, John Mayer, the list goes on. Like this has literally been a crazy journey, and I would say X is the GOAT because as long as he's been doing it, like late '90s to now, it's still relevant. You know, like we broke our production company Fella with this music video for DJ Khaled, Drake, and Bieber called Popstar. So it's been a crazy journey, and there were 2 kids from Brampton, Ontario, that went out to make art that broke out to the world, and now we're using our podcast as another form of storytelling, but through an audio medium.
Okay, how are you going to make that transition? You've been telling stories through video, now it's going to be only audio, so you're going to have to change your style a little bit, I guess.
I mean, we're talking to the creators, so it's a different kind of thing, you know what I mean? The story is the story of the maker, so it's not conceptualizing music and visuals to it. It's talking like the first podcast, the debut of the show was with Dave Myers, another guy that's been in the game for a long, long time, and just talking about the philosophy behind his approach to art, the work he's done, and as well digging into some of the larger world issues out there. Like we have a whole talk about Black Lives Matter on that podcast, and being a white director and his perspective coming up in a black music world. So it's a little different than what we're used to doing.
Without any spoilers, give me the kind of stories that you'll be telling. Give me an example of a story.
I guess the examples is pretty much their come up, what drew them in to get into this world of filmmaking, their influences, their highs, their lows, and pretty much their breakthrough moment. And a lot of times, to your point, Alan, like when you watch a music video, you're just seeing the end result, but you don't see what went into to make that product and that piece of art. If there was the storyboards and the art direction and sitting down with your head department and the collaboration. So it's pretty much we're giving them that kind of close set behind experience where you get to see the process of how we get to the finish line, right?
I've often watched music videos and wondered, where the hell did this come from? What kind of headspace do you have to be in to come up with these images, these storylines, these things? And I have no idea.
Yeah, and that's the point of the show. Like, look, we're probably like around the same age. Like, I came up in the '80s era where that's what made me fall in love with music videos, right? The MTV Much Music era, watching videos by like Madonna and Peter Gabriel and like Phil Collins and Michael Jackson and Aerosmith, and I was always fascinated by music videos and the storytelling and the dancing and the style and all that stuff. And that's what made us fall in love with the art. So imagine if you could go back in the days and sit down with Duran Duran and talk about the Hungry Like a Wolf video. Like, what the hell compelled you guys to be in this jungle and just going through this crazy story and sitting down with like the best of the best and hearing the stories of the directors working with Madonna and working with the Stones. And that's the beauty about the show. It's like we get that access to these filmmakers, to these artists that have worked with the biggest and brightest artists in the entertainment business, but learn about that journey, that creative journey, that collaboration to make the work that we see that's now on television or on YouTube. And before we jump, I just want to say, please follow us at Architects Pods.
I can't wait for this. Sounds like a great series. Looking forward to it. It's called Architects with Karina Evans, Taj Critchlow, and Director X. And I can't wait to hear some of these stories. Thank you so much, you guys.
All right.
To Henry Rollins on vocals by this time, with a fun, dumb song called TV Party. Another band we have to acknowledge is Bad Religion. Impeccable hardcore credentials. Lots of politics, social awareness, and rage. But at the same time, they gave everything a smooth edge with melodic vocals and even harmonies. Hardcore, but, here's that phrase again, pop sensibilities. This is a song from 1982. It starts and finishes very hardcore, but there's a breakdown in the center where, well, you'll hear it. Bad Religion with We're Only Gonna Die, a hardcore song with a little pop sandwiched in the middle. Another important group of the era was the Descendants. They were from Manhattan Beach, which is in the southwest part of Los Angeles. They were very hardcore at first, but eventually evolved into something unique. Again, the answer to standing out from the crowd was more melody. In 1982, they released a record called Milo Goes to College. 15 songs over in just 22 minutes. Pretty aggressive stuff. And yet, you see what I mean by the use of melody and harmonies? When that song, which is called Suburban Home, by the way, came out in 1982, it was hugely radical for American punks. You just did not sing like that. I mean, it just wasn't done. A group that took things even further was Husker Du, the hardcore band from Minneapolis. Insanely loud, very fast, but more than any other band on the scene, they showed that punk and melody could live in harmony. But that's what makes Husker Du so important in the development of alt-rock. If we have to zero in on one album, it would be their 1984 double record, Zen Arcade. The group thought hardcore had hit a wall, so it was time to try different things. The music was fast and aggressive, but it was also loaded with nuance. And it was a concept album, something that punk and hardcore bands were just not supposed to do. Concept albums were considered to be extremely uncool at the time, something best left to Pink Floyd and bands of that ilk. But Husker Du broke through that rigid, immovable, hardcore dogma. Zen Arcade tells the story of a boy who runs away from an abusive home, only to discover that the outside world was worse than what he'd left. For example, let me play a song called Pink Turns to Blue. Our boy has joined the military, dropped out to become a Hare Krishna, finds a girl only to lose her to drugs. And that's what this song is all about. Take note of the pop elements used to create this hardcore punk song. Husker Du from 1984's Zen Arcade album and Pink Turns to Blue. Next up, a trip back to California, where punk bands were conducting new experiments with melody, harmonies, and arrangements. This is part one of the history of pop punk, one of the most popular forms of alt-rock in the last 25 years. And we have a little more deep background to cover. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the drugs or something. But California bands decided not to be so serious when it came to punk rock after a while. This music started to get coverage in a new publication based out of San Francisco called Maximum Rock and Roll. When writing about Social Distortion or the Vandals or any number of melodic punk bands, the magazine began to throw around the term pop punk. Now, let's focus on Social Distortion for a second. In 1983, they released a debut album called Mummy's Little Monster, and it featured a single called Another State of Mind. If you listen closely, you can pick out the same elements that would later surface in the music of bands like Green Day and The Offspring. We'll call that proto-pop punk from Social Distortion, Another State of Mind from 1983. Some of the other proto-pop punks thought it was time to lighten up and inject some humor into the whole West Coast punk scene. And this is where we find the Vandals, who were formed at Huntington Beach in 1980. They loved their punk, but they also just couldn't take themselves too seriously. Maybe it was time to get a little goofy. For example, why not cover this song from the movie Grease? The Vandals from 1990 and Summer Lovin'. The album was called Fear of a Punk Planet and was produced by Bob Casale, the keyboardist for Devo. By the way, Kurt Cobain was a fan of the Vandals, and so was Eddie Vedder. 1992 seemed to be some kind of a turning point, a year when this emerging pop-punk thing started to gain some wider attention. That summer, Spin magazine published an article called California Dreaming. It mentioned a bunch of these melodic punk bands, some of which were signed to a Bay Area indie label called Lookout Records. Among the groups was a trio from the East Bay, who had a couple of albums already, and they were called Green Day. And this was one of the songs they were playing at the time. That's the original version, the pre-Dookie version, of Welcome to Paradise. Pop punk exploded in popularity throughout the 1990s. But how? And why? And who was behind all this music? Those are just some of the things that we'll talk about on part 2 of this look at the history of pop punk. Until then, don't forget about the Ongoing History podcast that you can get through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the other platforms. There are hundreds, and they're all free. Just download and go. Subscribe for faster service, and please rate and recommend if you can. It helps a lot. If you're looking for playlists for these shows, check my website, which is ajournalofmusicalthings.com. Just enter Ongoing History in the search field, and everything will pop up. I can be found on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and should you have any specific questions or comments, send them to alan@alancross.ca. Part 2 of the history of pop punk next time. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to the Ongoing History of New Music podcast with Alan Cross. Subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and everywhere you find your favorite podcasts.
Here's a list of words that should not go together, but do. Alone together. How many times have you heard that during the coronavirus pandemic? Deafening silence. I know what that means, but when you think about it, the juxtaposition is strange. Definitely maybe. Good name for a Britpop album, but an odd combination of words. Random order. Walking Dead. Original copy. Here's another one. Pop punk. You know what I mean by that. But those words should not go together. Punk was originally created as an attack on pop. I mean, how did we get from this to this? When you look at things like that, it is weird that those two songs are related. But do a DNA test, it will come back positive. Over the decades, pop and punk merged to create a hybrid that's responsible for selling hundreds of millions of records and concert tickets. How did this happen? That's what we're looking at. This is part 2 of a history of pop punk.
This is the Ongoing History of New Music podcast with Alan Cross.
Green Day for the fall of 1995 with Walking Contradiction, a single from the Insomniac album. Now, if we dig into that record, it's a little heavier than Dookie, which is the previous record. The lyrics are more on the doom and gloom side. It might be a little more sarcastic than anything that they had done to date, but it's an easy record to digest because of the song structures and the melodies. It is definitely punk, but at the same time, it incorporates pop songwriting sensibilities. There is no way to describe Green Day and what they do other than they're a form of pop punk. Hello again, I'm Alan Cross, and this is the second half of an exploration into this idea of punk and pop coming together to form an insanely successful form of alt-rock. On the last program, we dug into how the loud, fast, angry, and nihilistic punk of the 1970s and early 1980s morphed into the pop punk that is so big today. We looked at how melody and harmonies and all the other hallmarks of pop music turned punk into something a little bit different, and in many ways more palatable for those for whom pure punk was a little too intense. We left off when Green Day released a couple of records on an East Bay indie label called Lookout Records. And it's around here where the pop punk story really begins to take off. We'll pick things up in 1992. Now, this, of course, was the era of grunge. We had Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and so on. Then came the Smashing Pumpkins and Stone Temple Pilots and any number of bands that played slow and low, and sometimes with that quiet, loud dynamic. The sudden popularity of this branch of alt-rock caught everybody by surprise. Up until the early 90s, this was music for weirdos and outsiders. But in 1991, there was a fundamental shift in the way weekly album charts were compiled. This is important. Up until February 28th, 1991, album sales were merely